Good evening, my AP Biology minions. Today we're going to do our first presentation for our latest section, which is all about how we take your DNA and use it. Alright, one of the most important things you're ever going to hear me say is the concept that structure equals function. Now, last section, we spent a lot of time talking about the structure of DNA. And we talked about how it uses that structure to replicate, how we discovered that structure, all of the different things that have been said about that structure. And you can see a basic image of that structure in the diagram to the right. Now, what you have to think about is that for all the stuff we talked about its structure, and the nucleic acids, and the nucleotides, and DNA, and RNA, and all the way it was discovered, the base function of DNA is to store information. Everything that is required for you to be developed and to function as an organism is located in your DNA. Okay? Now, if the function of DNA is to store information, the ability to store information is included in the structure of DNA. So by understanding the structure of DNA, we're going to be able to talk about its function. Now, to really get your head around this, you have to understand that this information, all that stuff about how you do what you do or why you look the way you look, all of your traits, all the things we talked about with Mendelian genetics, they are stored in your DNA. So somehow those traits are in the structure of your DNA. They are in the structure of this double helix of deoxyribonucleic acid. So what this means is we need to talk a little bit about the molecular nature of all living things, all right? First off, you have to understand is that all of those traits that we talked about are molecular in nature, okay? So if you have an eye color, it's because there are molecules in your eye that give it a color. You have a skin tone, it's because there's molecules in your skin that give it a color. Your immune system fights off a disease, you have molecules in your blood that are part of your immune system that help you fight off a disease. All of your traits can be traced to a molecular origin. What happens is all of these different molecules have a specific structure. And like we said, structure equals function. So the structure of molecules gives them their function. Well, the functions are the things you know of as traits. All right, there's a molecular basis to your ability of your muscles to move. There's a molecular basis to your heart beating. There's a molecular basis to your brain allowing you to think. All of those traits, those functions, can be traced back to the structure of your molecules. Now, when we say molecules, there's actually a lot of different things. But what we are mostly concerned with is two different things. Enzymes, which we've already discussed somewhat, they are molecular catalysts. They are structures, molecular organic molecules that allow living things to catalyze chemical reactions. They allow those chemical reactions to happen faster. And then the other thing is polypeptide chains, or what's called proteins. Now, if you look over here to this diagram to the left, you'll notice that there are 4 different colors to this. Well, this is a protein. All right, this is what you know as a protein. This is actually the protein hemoglobin, and hemoglobin carries oxygen throughout your body as part of your red blood cells. Well, hemoglobin is actually 4 different polypeptide chains, and you can see that's what I've pointed out here. Well, those 4 different polypeptide chains come together to make a protein. So sometimes proteins are polypeptide chains, other times polypeptide chains need to come together to form a protein. Okay? So let's think about this for a second. All right? You've got the structure of DNA, which the main 2 things about that are that DNA is a double helix and DNA has complementary base pairing. Then you have the function of DNA, which is to store information, all right, but also to operate as a blueprint or as operating instructions. Well, the function of DNA gives you the structure of your molecules. So stored in that information, that blueprint, that operating instruction is the structure of polypeptides, the structure of enzymes. Structure equals function. So if your DNA gives your polypeptides, gives your enzymes their structure, Your DNA gives them their function. And the function of molecules is to aid chemical reactions, to provide structures in organisms. Your skin, proteins. Your hair, proteins. Your eye color, proteins. The lens that allows your eye to process light and see, proteins. The chemicals in the back of your eyeball that react to the wavelengths of light, proteins. Okay, you need to just understand that we could tie just about any structure and any function in any living organism back to their polypeptides and their enzymes. The polypeptides get their structure from information stored in the DNA. Well, how does DNA store that information? Well, we have to look at its structure. Now, these functions of these molecules, I mean, we talked about your immune system, your eye color. So you have to think about it this way. All organisms have traits. Those traits are actually molecules functioning. Well, if those molecules are functioning and we want to know how, we need to look at the structure of those molecules. Well, if I want to look at the structure of those molecules, I need to look at the DNA. And the function of DNA is to contain the information that is the structure of these molecules. And if I want to understand how DNA does that, I need to look at DNA structure. So we started here in our last section, and now we're moving on not only to this, but to how DNA gives us this. All right, so if we have this information encoded in our DNA, we have to go through the process of how it is extracted, okay? Now, I've said this several times. DNA, the structure of DNA, contains information. It allows the living organism to store information. That's its function. And its structure allows it to do that. Somehow, the structure of DNA will provide to living organisms both the structure of that organism's enzymes and the structure of that organism's polypeptides. And that's this whole process we're talking about, which actually includes transcription, translation, messenger RNA editing, okay? This whole step, we call this protein synthesis. And it's basically the methodology for extracting that information. And you can see over here on the diagram, here you've got DNA, all right? And this DNA becomes RNA, which then interacts with these structures called ribosomes, which then becomes a protein. Okay, so there's a lot of things we need to talk about in all of these steps, and in future presentations we're going to get into each step individually and talk about how they happen, why they happen. Okay, so let's start off with some of these steps. All right, without getting into a ton of the details. All right. Protein synthesis is a multi-step process. All right. The first thing you need to do is you need to copy the DNA in the nucleus. A eukaryotic organism does not want its DNA to leave the nucleus. You think about it, it makes a lot of sense. Why let it leave? It might get lost. It might get ruined. What if like a lysosome pops and destroys the DNA? Not to mention the fact that if you try to use the DNA directly, you're more likely to wear it out. And if you think about it, DNA has to not just last your life, it has to last generations because you have to pass it on to your offspring. And we mentioned this in the structure of DNA. Every time DNA is copied, a small piece of it is destroyed. That's why we have telomeres that are those dead ends of the DNA strand so that what gets destroyed doesn't actually matter. And then we have telomerase to help elongate those telomeres so that your DNA lasts longer. Well, if you used your DNA directly for the process of protein synthesis, you would have more problems than just replication. All right. So once this DNA has been copied and it's been removed from the nucleus, a cell needs to make edits of this DNA. It needs to change it so that it's all good and it's set up right and anything that needs to be removed is removed. Then the edited copy is used outside the nucleus as a template for protein structure. And these steps together are known as transcription and translation. And we're going to get into each of those in turn. In fact, they'll each have their own presentation. All right, cool beans, kiddos. We're done with this one.